Hi everybody, welcome to Leon's Chainsaw Parts and Repair. Happy Saturday morning. Alright, if you guys have been following the channel over the last couple weeks, you'll recognize this as the XL-500 that went kaput up on the hill. Had that bad spot in the cylinder that I knew about when I assembled it. Took a gamble. This time I lost. But fortunately, we're going to bring this bad boy back to life today. Brand new cylinder, courtesy of a great friend from House of Homelite. And I had in my stock of junk, a piston in stock, brand new rings. I'm going to go ahead and use a brand new connecting rod because I had it. So, other than, let's see, what haven't I replaced in that bottom end? I think the crank bearings are still original, but pretty much everything else is going to be brand new when we get done with this, so we're going to have one hell of a different result. But I thought I'd go through this in detail because there's a lot of guys that will email me and say, hey, I need to get to this part of a Super XL, or, you know, can I get the drive case cover off? I took those 5 bolts loose and it won't come off. And there's a reason for that. These things kind of come apart and go together in about one way, and if you get that out of sequence, you're just going to end up making yourself, you know, do a little more work. So I thought I'd show you the route I like to take for disassembling. Now I want to be clear before we go any further, I don't need to take the drive case off. I don't even think I'm going to take the handle off. No, I take that back, I am, because of the tank. But to get this drive case off, you literally have to disassemble the entire saw. Because there's a snap ring that retains the crank bearing to the crankshaft. That crank bearing has a groove that's cut in the outer diameter of it, and there are 2 washers and screws that slip down in there and screw it into this drive case. So you literally have got to have all of this other stuff off. You've got to have the engine apart, piston, cylinder, connecting rod all loose. And then when you pull those 5 screws, what you're going to be loosening or removing is the crankcase this direction. And in order to get the crankshaft out of the drive case, you've got to then take those 2 screws loose and press this out. So it's very involved in terms of you got to disassemble the entire saw, but it's not super difficult. I do have a video somewhere 6-8 months back that was, you know, kind of from that point on. But again, today we're going to go with disassembly. So in a case where you've got a Super XL, XL12, or even an XL-500 maybe, and you need to get down to the engine, this will do it. So we're just going to pick a spot and start. We know the carburetor and the airbox and all that jazz has got to come off. So I'm going to start with the carburetor. Get the choke rod, cotter pin out. Now this little devil likes to disappear on your bench. There's a lot of guys that have noted that. So I like to pull it out, straighten it, so that it looks like it'll go back in, and then use the air filter cover as a retainer spot for some of that little stuff, including the choke rod. So go ahead and get that out of the way. Now there's not enough room in these air boxes to get a socket on that lower carburetor bolt. And if I can't find my 5/16 wrench on this workbench, that's going to be a problem. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to start with this lower one, and half the time these are partially rounded off to where you can't even use the box end, you got to use the opened end. If they get to that point, it would be worth your time to order a new set. I'm certain I've got a ton of those things in stock. Sometimes these will loosen up to the point where you can turn them by hand. Other times, if it hasn't been off the saw in a while, now the upper one you can get a screwdriver in, if that slot's not all torn out. If it hasn't been off the saw for a while, or ever, odds are good that the reed valve retainer rubber is going to have shrunk to the bolt and force you to thread it out pretty hard. So just depends on your saw. But once you've got about a 1/2 inch of thread visible, that should be enough to get the carburetor off. you're going to be taking the reed block and the carburetor all as one. I'm going to get this fuel hose loose, and I'm still amazingly using the stock XL-500 fuel hose here. It is not totally shot at all. It still doesn't leak, hasn't cracked, anything, so. But it is old, so you got to be careful not to cause some damage. So when the carburetor is loose, you start working that entire reed valve assembly back, and you've got to pull the carb towards the muffler to get your high-low grommet loose. And then at that point you can just kind of pivot up. Again, the reed block and carb are going to come out as one assembly. Far and away the easiest way to deal with it. Okay, let's get our handle out of the way. If you've got the factory set up, you should have a socket head screw up here in the handle itself. This handle was a little bit sprung. You see how it came up just a bit as I started loosening this up. This was one of the pieces that was not in the batch of parts that most of the XL-500 came with. There were a few things that were missing. So I got a Super XL from the same era and just painted it up so that it would be proper to this saw. But when I went to bolt it on, I realized it had just a little bit of a spring. And since this saw has been painted, I'm going to try not to screw that up. Even though it's a runner that I intend to use on a regular basis, I'm going to try and treat it as I would any of my other nicer saws that I was using, and not going to baby it, but I don't want to rough it up just because. It doesn't make any sense. Alright, so here we're down, got some stuff off. If you're doing an ignition service, you can stop here if you want to take the time to pull your ignition boot, spark plug boot off. On an older wire, you're probably going to tear the end out if you go that route. Personally, I find it easier to just go ahead and pull the damn airbox off, and then you can service this ignition. If you got to take a coil off, you don't have to mess with the boot. 6-to-1, whatever your personal preference is, it doesn't matter, but that's what I'm going to do because I know I need to remove it anyway. So, you've got one screw down here, the 4 in the airbox. Again, the ones at the bottom you're not going to get a rattle gun on. I used good screws, so the box end wrench is going to work to loosen them up. And I didn't have anything super tight on this because obviously I had it apart to diagnose that for certain what had happened to that old piston and cylinder. And when I reassembled it, I knew that it wasn't going to be a permanent assembly, so I kept all this stuff loose. These airbox bolts can actually be very tight, especially if they've never been loosened before. Having yourself a good selection of these screwdrivers that have a long reach and the round shank, even though it's not as strong on something like this where you're working at an angle, it's less likely to tear up your paint when you get at one of those oddball angles. So there's 2 oil lines for the manual oiler. Right here should be the inlet and then on the inside is the outlet. You got to get both of those loosened up in order for the airbox to come off. And a 3/8 wrench. It's the proper size. Its outer one's super easy. The inner one, you've kind of got to reach in here and go at a little bit of an angle. But once you get it loose, you can get in there with your finger and usually just kind of spin it, and you'll know when she comes loose. And I can see that it's loose. Right now I am fighting with that XL-500 style fuel hose. Part of the reason I chose to keep this old hose was the fact that I'm still using the wick style filter, and the aftermarket hose is just a little bit small in this opening. Doesn't quite seal up, and I didn't want to have to use silicone or something on it. So alright, we need to get the flywheel off. If I was smart, I didn't tighten that down too much either. We'll see if I was smart. Never quite tell. It certainly wasn't very tight. That's hilarious. After all of that time, there was still a little blast media in these holes in the bottom of the fuel tank for the damn handle. Tell you, that is one thing about the aluminum oxide. It is so difficult to get that stuff contained once you've blasted something. Seems like no matter how much I use the air hose and brake clean and flush and just always manage to find some somewhere. Okay. See, that all comes out really nice and easily that way. So these saws had two different ignition systems, just like in the later electronic ignitions. There was a Phelon and a Weco, and you can typically tell the difference by the starter tag. This is a Weco. Typically what we find, whoa, there's a P there. That's interesting. This saw was originally a Phelon. That's what that P is denoting. Sometimes it's over here, sometimes it's here. So that is interesting. The important part is you need to match your systems. Make sure your flywheel, your coil, your condenser, and your points are all the same manufacturer. At that point it doesn't matter, as long as they're matched. If you mix the flywheel, not going to work. You mix, so the points won't even bolt up, and neither will the condenser, at least not properly. So if I was a purist, I'd ditch all this Weco stuff and go find a Phelon, but I don't care. It's not that big of a deal to me. So I am going to cheat a little bit, and I don't want to mess around with trying to get this. It's a cool morning here, and this hose is stiff. Rather than taking that and forcing it through, I'm going to take the tank and the throttle handle off as an assembly here, and just be careful not to mess things up. Now again, this has been apart previously. That's why nothing is tight. Set this out of the way. Alright, so now we're getting down to some meat and potatoes. We need to get that muffler out of the way though. There's no point in leaving it on that old cylinder. You can see the way these are built, the body is actually part of the frame. It's what holds the whole saw together, gives it structure. So there's a right and a wrong way to take it apart. That throttle handle has to be taken loose first because it screws to a tab on the fuel tank. So you can't take the fuel tank off without taking the throttle handle off. Okay. Alright, so at this point, we're going to get the cylinder off of here. I didn't put the piston or connecting, I think the connecting rod's still in here. I think I pressed the piston out of it. So we're going to do the routine of getting those little needle bearings to stay in place with the new rod. These outer cylinder nuts are easy to get to. The inner ones are a bit of a pain in the neck. And again, this isn't all that tight, but you're going to need a 7/16 open end wrench. And again, if there's not a huge amount of debris and junk over in here, once you get them loose, you can usually spin them off by hand using one finger. And this is yet another case where if you've got smaller fingers, you're going to be money ahead. If you got sausages, you've got a little more fun ahead of you. And this lower one's the hardest because of where those oil lines land. So sometimes, depending on the situation, you've got to bend them up out of the way just a little bit so you have room to actually swing the wrench to get enough of a stroke to tighten it or loosen it. And we'll go through that as we're putting the new cylinder on. Good news is all of this stuff is fairly clean, so we're not going to have to waste any time on that. Alright. So again, you can see these oil lines are up here against the cylinder. You got to get them down and out of the way. Don't go crazy, just go as much as you need to. And if there was a piston in here, obviously we'd be sliding that out. There isn't. Now, there's a recap. We had some chrome peel down at the bottom here. We ended up with some aluminum balled up right there. And yeah, the cylinder itself is deceiving. This makes you wonder, geez, I'd almost would be okay, even looking at it like this, if you could get the aluminum off of there, but I know better based on what it did to that old piston. Not going to throw it away though. I know a number of guys have gone to, I think it's US Chrome, and had cylinders replated. That might be a good candidate. Find another piston, and that way there's a backup floating around. So this little operation here is going to be one where this vise shines. This is what it's made for. It's like having 2 extra sets of hands. So I'm going to get this tilted up. Yeah, it's still in frame. What we're going to do is get the connecting rod out of there. And with the piston removed, that becomes pretty damn easy, especially if you get yourself a socket like this. Now this is a 3/8 drive. That's way of an overkill, but that's okay. I'm going to read 9/64. That's what an awful lot of these connecting rod bolts are. Now there is room to put an extension in there and just use the ratchet. I've developed a little technique I like better that'll even work when there's a piston in place, and that's to take your 1/4 inch box end wrench and use that right on the shank there. Having it in socket form means you don't have a little tiny bit flopping around that's easy to lose. You got something you can grip right here as you're turning. And if you really plan ahead, you can set it up and use box end. Now previously when I assembled this, I did put a new rod bearing set in here. So I want to save all these. There's no point in wasting them. Okay. But of course they're going to flop all over the place. Yeah, I don't see any damage. It all stayed up. The damage was limited up in the cylinder, but there's enough. Anytime you have a seizure on an engine, you need to clean this crankcase out. So that's going to be my next step. I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera off for that, because trying to get out there, hold a camera with brake clean and all that other jazz would be very difficult. But that's what I'm basically going to do. I'm going to get these needles out of here, get them contained, and then I'm going to clean this crankcase out thoroughly. I'm not just going to completely soak it down with brake cleaner, because I've got new crank seals in here and I don't want to damage those. But I'm going to clean out all the oily stuff, make sure I don't see any chunks, and I'm going to go at it with the air hose and just clean, clean, clean. The good thing is rolling it over, other than the rod cap that's down there, there's no noise. I don't feel any grit, any rough spots. So the odds that there's metal in the bearings is pretty slim. But right here at the base of the cylinder, you might not be able to see it on my finger. It may not focus there, but there was just a smidge of shiny, just a tiny, tiny bit. And that would have been some of that chrome that flaked right before the thing seized. And I sure as hell don't want to suck all that up and roach a new cylinder. So I'm going to get this all cleaned up, and then we'll come back for reassembly and test run. Okay. She is clean. Very clean. There's no debris of any kind. That's what it should sound like. This big roller bearing here, I like to give just about a half a pump from the oil can. I always put clean oil in here, never used, so that I can do stuff like this. And then just work it in. That's a nice little pre-treatment until she's running, and the two-stroke mix will start lubricating it. No point in firing it up dry. So we're going to go ahead and get this put back together. This is one of the most critical steps, and also one of the most tedious, especially if you haven't done it before. So this is an early crankshaft, and I believe it's common to the Super XL as well. It's the small journal crank. Don't ask me what the inches difference is, I have no idea. I can tell you the needles. This rod bearing has 28, the upgraded newer one has 31. Whatever the case is, you've either got 28 or 31 of these things you got to secure in place as you're getting the piston in there. Fortunately, there's a few tricks, and we'll go through those. If you're using a brand new bearing from Homelite, they've got some sort of a waxy substance that's typically holding them together in a nice strip. Most of the time, not always, but most, you can break that in half and get half on the cap side and half on the rod side, and get it in there without too much trouble. In a case like this where none of that material's there, we're going to use a light coat of grease, because the grease will dissolve fairly quickly when fuel starts going through there, and it'll be exhausted and you won't have to worry about it. Man, they don't normally tighten those new connecting rod bolts down that hard. And even with new parts, we want to make sure they're good and clean. Just because they came out of a box doesn't mean that they're ready to go. So we're going to check all this stuff really good before we get any needles in there. Now these rods, they fracture the cap off. So there's only one way it can go. You take it like this and rotate that cap, and it doesn't sit flat, doesn't line up. If you assemble the engine that way, it's going to bind. So you want to make sure that everything is super. It should fit like a glove. So doing it the way I'm doing it here, you also have to watch out and make sure that you get your piston pin oriented the right way and keep your rod cap oriented the right way. So that's the closed end of the piston pin, that's the opened end. Closed end goes towards the muffler. So we need to keep this cap clocked, and I'm going to check that before I put it back in. But if we ended up getting it reversed, slipped it in here one way, oh it doesn't fit, swivel the piston to match, then all of a sudden you got the opening on the wrong end, and you'll start accumulating carbon in here. I've heard of instances where the pin pops loose and does damage. The carbon can cause scoring. We'll keep it lined up right. Yeah, that doesn't even come close when it's opposite. Okay, so I mentioned grease. Again, you want to keep your grease can covered. This is just some old black axle grease. So it's a chilly morning. It's not frozen around here, but this is still, you know, good and pliable. So that's what you want. Something that's not so heavy that it'll pack in there. You want the fuel to be able to wash it out. So you're going to take your rod cap and get a film in there. Do the same on the rod side. Now there's probably debates out there, just like there is with fuel mix ratios, about what to use in here and how much. This method I'm using here has worked for me for a long time, so I'm going to stick with it. So then, I think I've used the word tedious already, we're going to start that tedious task of getting these little needles in there. And sometimes when you're grabbing them out of here, you might get 2 or 3 at a time. 1 at a time is probably the best. You're just going to line them up in here and try to set them in place as much as possible so you're not shoving grease around. And the reason that's important is you need them to stay in place, and the more you move them around, the more they're going to take the grease off the cap, and then they'll have a tendency to move around. And the last thing you want is to get the engine together thinking that you're good when you've dropped one of these needles in there. Because then what's going to happen is it's going to suck that needle up between the piston and the cylinder wall. And I think we all know what happens at that point. You are toast. So having a dental pick of some sort around here to kind of pull them into place, straighten them up. You want to get them basically in kind of flush, all at the same back and forth, so that when you go to put it in the engine, you're not knocking needles loose on the crank weights. Now, I'm not counting these at this point. I did count before turning the video back on just to verify that I had all 28 accounted for. Okay. And you don't want to make the mistake of trying to overload one side or the other with too many. That'll just make your life miserable down the road. You want them basically flush with the fracture surface here. Okay. Not convinced that I won't have a little trouble with that one I just put in, but we'll see. Super important to keep your hands clean in this process. Don't pick up any dirt or debris or other crapola off your bench. This is probably one of the most critical parts of this whole thing. Getting these needles in place and getting it assembled and the rod bolts tightened without having one drop. If you can do that and you've kept everything clean, the odds are really stinking good that you're going to have a successful test run. No certainties, of course. Never is in this kind of stuff. Oop. And that's the last thing you want to do. I take that back. The last thing you want to do is drop one on the floor. Trying to find one of these needles on a concrete garage floor is not good. That's why I've got this so far back, away from the edge and sitting on a paper towel. Typically, if the needle falls on the towel, it's not going to bounce around too much. If somebody out there is watching this and going, why the hell are you doing it that way? This way is so much easier. Please, by all means, share. Because I think we would all love a quicker but reliable way of doing this. Alright. See, I just rolled that one down. That's going to be... That one's going to try and give me trouble, I can already tell. Doesn't help that I think this dental pick, it might be magnetized. Okay. We'll clean that piston again before we assemble, but with any luck we can get this thing together. And this is another one of those where I don't know how well I'm going to do at maintaining a good camera angle for you guys. But what I have found is I need the long screwdriver. I'm going to set that over there so it doesn't get dirty. And then I use a pair of small, medium-sized needle nose pliers to set that cap in place. And the screwdriver is going to hold it while I get the piston over there. Alright, so that's the proper cap. We want the closed end of the pin over there. And therefore, my wife's going to call me right in the middle of the video. Hold on, folks. Okay, phone's put aside, it ain't gonna ring again. Alright. Still, that needle gives me a little heartburn there. see. Hopefully won't have trouble with it. Alright, so I'm going to grip this right through the bolt hole. These are pretty hard threads. You'd have to push pretty hard with this thing to cause a problem. So what you want to do is rotate, and this does take steady hand. Rotate the crankshaft. Ha! Alright, so this is going to be a pain in my butt. That needle that I was worried about is now here on the crank journal. Right where I don't want it to be yet. Oh yeah. These are the kind of things you can expect to run into. I would say one out of every two of these that I do, there's a drop needle that becomes a pain in the ass. But the key is recognizing it right away and doing something about it. So this is going to go back on the piston side. I'm going to try and put it in the middle and capture some grease. And get that flat. Alright, damn it. This is what I was talking about. Once you start having to move the damn things around, it's almost always a pain in the ass. Alright, so I've been screwing around long enough here. I'm going to double check and make sure I still have the cap oriented. Oh, come on. Alright, that all looks good. I'm going to take two. So the goal here is to get this thing between the crank weights and then up onto the journal without knocking any of those needles loose. Alright, now that time I succeeded. So this is where, yeah, there we go. No. Roll the crank down, so okay. Now obviously you guys can't see down in here. I'd have to have a head cam to do that, but I'm using the screwdriver to hold this up against the crankshaft, and I can see that the one needle moved just a little bit here. So I've pushed that down just a smidge. All right. Yeah, when I fit that thing. This is really getting irritating, folks. There's always a little bit of a pain, but this is turning into one of the more irritating ones that I've done recently. Okay. Opened end of the piston pin towards me, and here also you want to drop this down about smacking the crank weights with one of those needles, and then you got to carefully get these rod bolts in. The good part is if you can turn this by using your fingers on this side, as soon as you get it snug, that cap can't come loose enough to let a needle drop. And that's moving smoothly. Which means we did it right. little bit of extra goofing around, but in the end, it's worth it. That is the most critical and difficult piece to achieve right there. So, now you can see that technique that I like to use, using this socket even with the piston in place, especially a piston this big, it fits under the skirt real easily. Now I'm holding this piston, basically covering it with my fingers so that it doesn't jam into these cylinder studs. Because you can tear up the wall of your piston. And nobody wants to do that. Especially not with old, hard to find parts. Hell, even the new, easier to find parts are still expensive. So you just got to be careful. Oh, come on, you. Okay. That is moving smoothly. If we had dropped a needle, there'd be up and down play, and if we had one jammed where it slipped out of place and got sideways or something, this wouldn't rotate at all. So as long as she's going smooth, you know that you've achieved what you needed to achieve. So, whew, the rest of this ought to be pretty easy. Let me grab my brake cleaner. And we're just going to do a quick wipe down on the piston. Get a little bit on the towel, just in case there's any old dust or debris or crapola. Tape residue, plastic bag that went bad that it was in, you know. Like this piston would be somewhere between 40 and 50 years old. And that plastic bag that it was packed in, God knows how much it's deteriorated, but we know that it has. Okay. We're going to do the same thing and give the cylinder a wipe down. Okay. Looks pretty good. Pretty darn good. Alright. Now, the best way, and there's no way around this, you need a ring compressor to put these engines together and not risk damaging your rings. These little cheesy plastic kits that come in 3 sizes are pretty common on eBay. Just get one. If you're going to work on these saws, just get one. So once it's cleaned, I'm going to just drizzle a little oil into the ring landings here. You don't want to go totally crazy here, just enough to lubricate it up. This is another important note. Make sure before you try to use that ring compressor that your rings are basically centered on the anti-rotation pin here. That way you're not trying to compress them on top of the pin, because that's just not going to work. Your cylinder wants a coating of oil too. Not super heavy. I mean, you don't want to foul your spark plug the first time that you turn the thing over. But you want any surface where that piston is going to touch to have a nice light coating of oil. And that includes these little transfer port ridges here. Alright. Now, you take your ring compressor, expand it, set it over the top, And I like to set this so that I'm squeezing and watching the rings close right at that anti-rotation pin. And you want to get it so that there's just 30 seconds of the piston showing above your compressor. And then be sure to set your cylinder in place the right direction with the muffler port facing the right way. That always helps. And just guide it down. When the crank bottoms out, you can start sliding your cylinder in place, and once your ring has disappeared out of your point of view, you can by hand rotate your crankshaft. Don't try and pull up on the cylinder, you're just going to pull it right off the piston again. Rotate it with the crank up to get your compressor tool out, and then let it come back down and guide her down onto the cylinder studs. And that should go down pretty damn easily like that did. If you're fighting with it and if something's jammed, figure out what it is. I've seen cylinder studs that are a little bent. Okay, that can be dealt with. But if you for some reason have a ring that popped partially out of a landing, or it slipped over the anti-rotation pin in the piston, something like that, you should never have to hammer on a cylinder to seat it, I guess is what I'm getting at. So go slow, go easy. Don't destroy your new parts. Alright, so we'll get the cylinder nuts back on here. And here's a great classic example of how these oil lines can be a pain in the butt. That one, the nut slid down and was blocking access to this stud entirely. This is the hardest one to reach. And you basically have got to use your fingertips. Usually when you set the nut on the top of the stud, it kind of guides itself into place. But because we're making a video, it's not going to. I'll flip it. See if it wants to play nice that way. There we go. And then once you've got some oil on your fingers, this becomes even more difficult. You can see you got to get that oil line. God. And this is really going to be fun. I'm back out of the way. There we go. I know some guys grind down box end wrenches and to half the thickness of normal. It makes it a little easier to get in here. I've always been able to get by, and I haven't had to custom a tool up like that yet. And this is not going to be the exception. We're not doing that today. And I'm not going to full tightness either. I've just touched the lock washer there because I want to tighten these kind of evenly. Make sure that this thing is fully seated down to the deck before torquing these down. Some of these cylinders, you've actually got to get these nuts started on all four studs before you tighten it down, because you got to lift it up just a bit to get them in there. Some of I think the Super Easy and maybe the XL-100 series are like that. But you'll know, as you're taking it apart, you'll know. Because if you're taking it apart and you get a nut loose and it won't come all the way out, it's one of those that the cylinder's got to be lifted a little bit to get the nut in and out. So. Alright. looking at it, I can see everything's seated properly, so let's get this thing torqued down. And this is only a 1/4 inch thread, so you don't have to go nutsos with it. But you want those lock washers completely compressed and some tension on them. If the cylinder actually managed to loosen up while it was running, you can imagine what kind of damage that would do. Okay. And I saved the hardest one for last. Like I say, we're going to get it. There's just enough relief milled into here to get full turns. Alright, we're good. And I didn't bend those oil lines too badly. Okay. That's the hardest part, folks, is just getting, once you're to that point, the rest of this stuff is gravy. Piece of cake. We'll be doing a test run before we know it. Oh, I'm going to rotate this thing back down. Especially setting those rod bearings. If you don't have a vise to put it in, most people aren't going to have this. There's only 2 in existence that I know of, and I'm thankful to have one. But you could always put your bucking spike in your bench vise and hold it up. You got to have a solid surface to work with when you're setting those rod bearings into place. If it's moving at all, things are not going to go the way you want them to. All right. We're going to put the fuel tank and throttle handle back on. Come on. Okay, now, I think I've talked about it in previous videos, but we're going to cover it again. These fuel tank screws, especially on the later models, had a real tendency to back out. And when they back out, they go into the back of the flywheel. And they'll grind for a little bit, and then pretty soon it'll be catching enough it'll make the saws feel like it's seized. An awful lot of those 90s saws were thrown away because I have it on pretty good information from great information actually, because it's from a former Homelite employee that said a whole batch of those fuel tank screws didn't make it into the tumbler with the Loctite. So they never got Loctite on them. Well, that's a problem. So I'm using Loctite Red. I know somebody somewhere will say that's a mistake, but I haven't found it to be. I can still get them back out if I need to. But I also know that with Loctite Red, I'm not going to have one of these back out into a flywheel. And I'm not a big fan of carving the back of my flywheels. Okay. Much better. Alright. Now we got to get these oil lines plumbed. And this, you basically want to get it lined up on the inside one where the barrel's in the seat. And then you need a small screwdriver, or where the hell I flung that little dental tool. Something to push the nut. As you're watching it, push it and get it started on the threads, and then you should be able to start it with your finger and get a half a turn or so. Biggest thing when you go to use your wrench is it should spin pretty easily, and if it doesn't, you got to cross-thread it, and you better stop and figure it out, because otherwise you're going to strip that nut out, and then you're going to have to replace the whole line, which, depending on which one it is, may mean taking the tank and cylinder back off. So, you want to avoid that. That went on easily. This one will go on easily too, but I want to get these bolts in place first. This paint system that I use with that super hard clear coat is good, but the paint does get brittle when it comes to, you know, where screw heads are going to ride. You're going to chip some paint, and depending on how tightly you have to torque it, you may chip some on the outside of the bolt head. I haven't found a way around that. It is what it is. The best thing that I know of is to assemble, you know, within a week of doing the clear coat. It's still getting harder at that point, but it has more of a tendency to smoosh, I guess, than chip. This stuff's all been painted for, God, 6 months it seems like now, so I can see little areas that I've damaged. I guess it is what it is. And that's the cost of trying to make a 60-year-old saw look nice again and still be able to use it. So you don't want to torque these things down all the way until you get the bottom one in down here. And that's another one, you want to start it by hand. There we go. Make sure you don't cross-thread it. Cross-threading is bad. These threads can be repaired with helicoils. I've done it. But it's more work, and you are eliminating metal by upsizing for the helicoil, so you are losing some strength. If you can avoid it, it just makes sense to avoid it. And these don't have to be crazy stupid tight, but you want them to be tight. This is creating the seal between the crankcase and the airbox here, using the upper part of that cylinder gasket, so you definitely don't want an air leak around there. Alright. Oh, look what I did. I should have bolted the coil in place first. Now we're going to see why I should have done that. Because you can't fit that damn coil boot through there. It doesn't fit. Now I replaced this wire the last time, so I know I'm not going to damage it. But you basically got to pull the damn boot off. And now we're going to have to mess with fishing that back on. I should have paid attention to what I was doing. Oh well. Come on. So, you just find that nice little routing. It'll be easy to see. Push it through. And we'll get this secured in place. That's probably the biggest, or I should say the most common assembly disorder I end up having. Whatever reason. Get in a groove, start bolting stuff together, and go, God dang it, I didn't put the coil in. Right, those are all started. Okay. And now I'm going to count on the fact that this just came off to help it go back on a little easier. This one's going to be way easier than most of them are. This is typically a big pain in the butt. Get these boots on, especially if your wire's old and getting fragile. I keep some copper core replacement on hand that I just cut to length in a lot of cases. And just fighting with an old rotten wire isn't good, and if it's out here like some of them are, where it's close to your finger, if you end up with a bad spot in the insulation, you're running your saw and all of a sudden you get zapped through the finger. I'm not a big fan of that. Alright. Double check this since the coil has been off. I want to make sure that our points are still gapped properly. And by golly, it is. Yeah, everything's nice and tight. That'll wear in pretty quick. Whew, nice. I'm pretty excited about getting this thing fired up and having it be right. There aren't going to be too many guys that you run across that are using one of these things for some regular firewood cutting. I am looking forward to it. And I'll tell you one other thing. I know I've talked about it in the videos off and on. Boy, folks, when I start talking, I start forgetting. That little felt is supposed to go between this box and the crank seal. Right there. Okay. We'll try this yet again. What I was starting to say, I've talked about it in past videos about the trouble that I've had with leaks at the fuel tanks. And they're not, it's not a leak that's going to leave a puddle on the floor, but these gaskets on a lot of these tanks, and even the ones that are permanently bonded, that old sealer allows a certain amount of vapor to escape. And I did the most recent one that I had a problem with a couple of years ago was a 360. Now, that's a bonded tank. I didn't think I'd have any trouble with it at all, but I ended up with bubbles in the clear coat right at the seam of the damn tank, and I'm like, seriously? I mean, how do you combat that? And on that particular saw, I'm still not sure how I would combat that. But what I can say is that I experimented with these tanks where you can get the tank split in half. I experimented with some material, and the MotoSeal, of all things, the fuel-resistant MotoSeal, has so far been the answer. So what I did on this tank, and a couple before it, was I split it apart, painted them, clear coated them, reassembled them using the MotoSeal as the gasket, and therefore there's no clear coat that's actually sealing that seam. And between it and the MotoSeal, this tank's had fuel in it for, 3 weeks now. It hasn't leaked a drop. And there's no bubbled paint, most importantly. So, recap on that. If you're painting one of these saws that you're going to run, you got to make damn certain that you're not getting any vapor coming through the tank seam there. and bubbling up under your paint, because it will, that fuel vapor will soften the clear coat and allow it and the paint to bubble. That's just going to happen, unfortunately. Learned that one the hard way. Right now I'm looking for that flat washer. There we go. And also the lock washer. The first XL-500 that I restored that's in my collection, you guys saw it run at the first get-together with TJ a year and a half ago maybe. It bubbled after I had let it sit. So I've still got to repair a couple spots on that. Or maybe I did repair. I'll be honest, I can't remember if I got around to repainting the tank or not, but that's where I started experimenting with painting the tank in halves. But I would say that if you have a pristine restored saw that's been repainted and you've run it, and you may run it just a little bit here and there, I would not store it with fuel in the tank, and I'd leave the cap cracked a little bit when it's up in your attic or wherever you store your saws, just to be on the safe side. Because it's a pretty sickening feeling to see a good paint job ruined with, a bubble of fuel vapor. It's not a good thing. Alright, quick check here. I want to put the carburetor in next because it's easier to get the high-low grommet in place with the starter cover off. So just index your carb onto the throttle shaft, guide everything into place here, and it can be a little bit of a pain getting the reed valve past everything to get it in. Everything's got to be just right. There it goes. And now I need to get that fuel hose on here, at least started. This is the old big barb on the carburetor, and getting everything started is a little tough with that. Once it starts to go, it's easy. There we go. Alright, now I can at least get this started. The two mounting screws. Good thing about these Super XL style saws is the gaskets for the reed block back here tend to stay stuck to the air box, and that makes getting this all going a lot easier. If it's loose and flopping around, it's real easy to lose it off the end of the back of the screw and have it not in the right place. Then you'll have a giant air leak. Probably won't even run, but if it did run, you'd be lean as heck. Get this into place. Homelite was good about making these these various areas like this carb box very, very compact, to where you've got just the absolute minimum amount of space that you need to get something done. Super Easy is probably the worst. I know I've griped about it on videos before, about not being easy to work on, pardon the pun. So get your high-low into place before you tighten it down all the way, and your life will be a whole lot easier. Because as this tightens down, it tends to rotate the carb clockwise just a little bit, and that puts the needles pretty close to the airbox chamber there. So if you get the grommet in first, it'll seal everything up nice and tight, and it won't be a big hassle for you. Now, depending on which one of these bolts you're tightening, you may want to close the choke. Like this one, I'm going to hit the choke plate if I don't get it the heck out of my way. And I'm not a huge fan of the idea of bending the choke plate trying to tighten these studs down. Again, these do not have to be screaming tight. If you can look in here, you get some good pressure, look in here and you see your gaskets are laying flat. And just starting that little bit of edge pucker, then you have it tight enough. And no need to go any further. Alright. There's that fuel hose on. Now the carb is in place. It's pretty easy to pull it all the way up the barb where it belongs. Alright, bingo. We're here, we might as well do the choke rod. So, with this little baby cotter pin that retains that damn choke rod in place, you got to get it bent so that it's basically back together, and that's why once you've got it in, you got to bend one end out, you know, so it doesn't fall out. But I don't like to get carried away with this. Take the one end and I go maybe 25 or 30 degrees and call that good, so that when you go to take it back out, you don't have a big twisted mess. You should be able to get 3 or 4 at least in and outs on those cotter pins before they are so mangled that it won't work. Alright, let's get this last oil line hooked back up. Again, we'll seat the barrel in there and then start that nut by hand. If you're working on a repainted saw, be careful you don't reach too far back with your wrench and rub paint off right there. Don't ask me how I know that. Okay. Should be ready for a starter. And we can test some spark. Even though I know it has good spark, we're going to test it before getting too much further, just to make sure. Get your kill switch wire on. There she's seated. This is another assembly. Pretty much in general, if you got more than one screw in an assembly, you want to get them started by hand in all locations. You want to hold the starter in place, especially if you've got it sitting the way I do where it can fall back out. What I did there was index it into the starter pawls by pulling the rope out and letting it retract. It got the pulley seated in there. And this is the most common place that I end up chipping a little paint. Right on these mounting bosses. And this is no different. But it is what it is. Alright. Do we have spark? I'll see if I can hold that so you guys can see it. Oh, look at that. Beautiful spark. And it's sparking at a nice low RPM. That's what we want. So, we're here. We'll just get this part wrapped up. I have no idea how much time this video is going to end up being. I'm going to guess it's somewhere around an hour. So I know it's a long one, but say a lot of guys have talked about assembly and disassembly on these saws. Oh, look at that. Oh, that oil has got the compression way the hell up there. Plus, it's new parts. I mean, that's just cool. Let's get our handle on. Then we'll get the muffler. And you guys are going to see a live test fire and a little bit of the break-in. I'm going to let this thing idle for probably the better part of a half an hour. Let those rings seat and all that jazz. I'm not going to leave the camera running for all of that, but want you guys to see it running. And then, of course, I'll do a follow-up video next time I go up to cut some firewood. This bad boy will be going along. Okay. Starting to look like a saw again. Alright, muffler time. What the hell did I put in there? Ha! No, sir, I'm not going to make that mistake. I don't know what the hell that CJ8 came out of. Or is that a 6? I guess it is a 6. Never mind. Thought I'd grabbed a CJ8 off the bench here at first, and that would be 2 heat ranges too hot. And in a 2-stroke engine, that matters a lot. You can go on the web, and some of these spark plugs are hard to find in the original, what the IPLs call out for them, but there's enough cross-reference tables on Champion and NGK's websites that you gotta be able to find something modern that will work. Alright, now that's slipped out of its proper hole. Everything else is good. As you're assembling these, especially these Super XLs with this older style muffler, you've got to put your baffle, and if you're running a spark arrestor, in my state it's absolutely required, even on an old saw, you got to get these studs in first. You can't slip them on after the fact. So you want to make sure to get that right. And muffler studs are another thing that I like to hand tighten in a little ways, just to make sure that nothing's going kablooey. Wait a minute. Ha! Awesome. Should have paid attention that the replacement cylinder has the third mounting boss here. The old cylinder did not have that. So I can take this screw that was plugging this out and actually use it the right way. Much better. Alright, try this yet again. Okay, that's going to work. Thankfully, this muffler can isn't all messed up. Some of these things, the bolts have come loose enough times that you end up with wallered out holes, and sometimes you have to put a flat washer on that screw. Alright, let's see if I can get away with doing what I just did. Seriously? Yeah, that's good. So why am I having trouble here? There we go. I hope. Come on. Can we maybe cooperate here? This design is not the most user-friendly, as you can tell. I'm gonna get these damn bolts lined up and started, and still get that damn baffle there, and everything to sit flat in the muffler body. Okay, I'm getting a little bit tired of you. I don't know why this bolt is being such a pain. But I'm not going to put up with it, I'll tell you that much. The last thing I'm going to do is tear out the mounting holes on a brand new cylinder. And I know I've got some muffler bolts in here somewhere. Come on. There we go. Much better. Huh. Well, I'll run that across the die later. Like I say, I'm not going to screw up a cylinder that's this uncommon. Okay. Another thing I like to do, even though it's messy and it's an extra step, on these outer muffler bolts, I really like to use some anti-seize. I think any of us that have worked on a couple of these saws have come to those ones where you go to loosen this outer bolt and take the muffler cover off, and you end up loosening the whole stud assembly. And you gotta fight with that. So you end up loosening the entire stud all the way through, and it tries to come out still attached to the muffler cover. And sometimes it works, and sometimes you end up destroying the muffler cover. Okay. This thing's going to make a mess with oil on the bench as I run it, but that is what it is. Let's get some fuel back in and we'll see how this goes. All right. Here goes nothing. stop the video now. That's enough for me to know she's going to be fine. She's going to be just fine. I'm going to keep running it. Let it idle for about a half an hour. Just let it break in. Kind of do that little rev here and there. Modulate the speed a little bit. Get a little more tuning. Definitely running a little rich right now for break-in. That's fine. But some of the smoke is also the oil and assembly grease that's coming out. So anyway, look for, I'm hoping in the next couple weeks there'll be a video of this bad boy cutting up on the hill.